Hello and welcome to the Book of Revelation Historicist View. We are Lebanon Springs and this is part 23, Prelude to the End. I'm glad you're here with me today. I'd like to cover one quick programming note at the top of today's video. I've always had an open policy regarding questions and comments. In fact, I love the encouragement I've received from many of you. My main goal, however, is to put out good and what I believe to be really important content, and as quickly as I can. And where I tend to get myself into a defensive posture when it comes to my work, I find that that can impede my main goal. So to slow that roll, I would like to ask those of you who want clarity on any of my content, or maybe you just want to share how this series is impacting your faith, to feel free to send questions and comments through email at lebanonspringshouse@gmail.com. Or if you'd like, you can message me on our Facebook page, Lebanon Springs House Ministries. You'll find both of those links below. I look forward to hearing from those of you whom I've conversed with in the past, you know who you are, as well as those new to this series. I'll do my best to read and answer every contact, but again, this series is not the only thing I'm juggling here at the ministry, so while I greatly appreciate your contact, I truly appreciate your patience as well. And now, on to our review of the two-part video on the mark of the beast. We learned that the scriptures instruct us to tie or bind God's commandments as a mark or sign upon our hands and foreheads to inform our actions and thoughts. We also saw that the name of Daniel's fourth kingdom was given to John in a code because it was the Antichrist kingdom, Rome, and heretofore that fourth kingdom had not been named. We also saw that the three Greek letters used in the number of this beast's name, while that was really a symbol showing that this beast would appear to be Christ-like. In fact, he would appear to be Christ, and yet he would proclaim or promote pagan sun god worship. Now that's to say, doctrines and rituals antithetical to biblical teaching. Not only did we see these clear pictures in the book of Revelation from the Messiah himself, but those with ears to hear and understand what these pictures imply. You know, we know that by instructing us to bind his commandments upon our hands and foreheads, we show that it's the Creator's commands and feast days that we keep. We understand that keeping the Pope's commandments and his feast days, well, that may very well reveal we belong to a different system. Now, that's a tough question to ask ourselves, but Messiah's revelation really leaves us no other choice. And by giving us a code for the name of the fourth kingdom, the beast kingdom, which signifies Rome, as we've said, we understand that Messiah is telling us that the Roman Church is a false system of religion. In fact, in just a few chapters, Messiah is going to tell us this church coincides with the whore who rides the beast being the Holy Roman Empire. You know, a very foundational question to ask everyone you know, really, is who is Jesus Christ? That's how you know if you have a counterfeit. But to ask who the Pope is and how one views the Catholic Church of Rome, that's another important question, because their official Jesus Christ, as we discussed in our last video, is definitely another Messiah. Again, a hard question, but Messiah's revelation leaves us no other choice. And finally, we have to ask the hard question, do we behave like this beast? Are we worshiping Yahweh, the Creator, according to his prescription, his commandments and his feasts? Or are we celebrating and promoting traditions borrowed from Babylonian pagan sun god worship? Sobering questions indeed, but questions Messiah's revelation prompts us to ask. Now today we're going to cover chapters 14 and 15, and as I told you last time, these chapters are given during the intermission or the second interval period. But though the action is not picked back up per se, John is definitely seeing visions concerning the future. He sees the Lamb standing on Mount Zion with the 144,000. He sees three angels flying through the air, each declaring a very specific message. He sees someone with a sharp sickle in his hand who is about to reap the earth. And finally, he sees 7 mighty angels carrying bowls full of plagues. Why is John receiving these visions at this time when we're barely halfway through the book? Well, that's what we're going to attempt to answer today. Are you ready? Beginning with the symbolism of chapter 14, verses 1 through 5, about the Lamb and the 144,000, we read, "And I looked, and lo, a Lamb stood on the Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his Father's name written in their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven as the voice of a great thunder, and I heard the voice of harpers harping with their harps. And they sung, as it were, a new song before the throne, and before the 4 beasts and the elders. And no man could learn that song but the 144,000, which were redeemed from the earth. These are they which were not defiled with women, for they are virgins. These are they which follow the Lamb whithersoever he goeth. These were redeemed from among men, the first fruits unto God and to the Lamb. And in their mouth was found no guile, for they are without fault before the throne of God." Covering 2 chapters today, it's going to be difficult to stop at every nuance. So we're really going to highlight what I feel is most significant while still painting the overall picture. And I want to address the idea that these 144,000, whomever they may be, they're said to be virgins, and we're given the clarifying phrase, "not defiled with women." Now, this is without a doubt one of those pivotal details that has been very much misunderstood, I think, throughout the years. Indeed, it's eluded many of us, if not for centuries. It's also one of those details that I believe the Roman Catholic Church focuses in on, this idea of these people being virgins. So this is one of those points that we're going to research thoroughly in just a while. And we begin by asking whether or not it's even possible to expect that so large a group would be virgins in the usual understanding of the term. Well, Albert Barnes suggests that's not really feasible. This passage cannot be adduced in favor of celibacy, whether among the clergy or laity, or in favor of monastic principles in any form. For the thing, he says, that is specified is that they were not defiled with women. And a lawful connection of the sexes, such as marriage, he says, is not defilement. The word rendered here defiled is a word that cannot be applied to the marriage relation. It means properly to soil, to stain, to defile, as used in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Their conscience being weak is defiled. And Revelation chapter 3, where we saw the church who did not defile their garments. He says the word does not elsewhere occur in the New Testament except in the passage before us, and it will be seen at once that it cannot be applied to that which is lawful and proper, and consequently that it cannot be construed as an expression against marriage and in favor of celibacy. So there's a little bit of information that we're going to look at even closer in the interpretation portion of today's video. Now next, in regard to the lamb standing on Mount Zion, Matthew Henry says, a counterfeit lamb is mentioned as rising out of the earth in the last chapter, which was really a dragon. Here, Christ appears as the true paschal lamb to show that his mediatorial government is the fruit of his sufferings and the cause of his people's safety and fidelity. Now, of this very same picture, the Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary, in quoting Karl Oberlin, an eminent German theologian born in 1824, adds, in contrast to the beast, false prophet, and apostate church, and introductory to the announcement of judgments about to descend on them and the world, stand here the redeemed, the divine kernel of humanity, the positive fruits of the history of the world and the church. They continue. The 14th through the 16th chapters describe the preparations for the messianic judgment. As the 14th chapter begins with the 144,000 of Israel, no longer exposed to trial as they were in Revelation chapter 7, but now triumphant. So the 15th chapter begins with those who have overcome from among the Gentiles. The two classes of elect forming together the whole company of transfigured saints who shall reign with Christ. So John seems to be looking into the future and seeing possibly the end result of everything here on earth. The question would be, again, why so early in the text? Why now? And moving on to verses 6 through 13, and the messages of these three angels we read. And I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, and to every nation, and kindred, and tongue, and people, saying with a loud voice, Fear God, and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him that made heaven and earth and the sea, and the fountains of water. And there followed another angel, saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. And we've certainly spoken of spiritual Babylon in this series before. Notice how Messiah ascribes a feminine pronoun to Babylon. And in just a few chapters, as I said earlier, we will see why. And the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, If any man worship the beast in his image, and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation, and he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. Without mixture, that means the full strength of Yahweh's anger. Wow. And the smoke of their torment ascended up forever and ever, and they have no rest day nor night, who worship the beast in his image, and whosoever receives the mark of his name. At this point, I want to remind you that we're still in an interval, which means John is seeing visions of spiritual events. It does not mean that these events are happening in the moment. No, in fact, during intermissions, the action is kind of paused until the curtain rises again. Here is the patience of the saints, John tells us next. Here are they that guard the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. Now, in this commentary, we see the word patience in the Greek, number G5281, really meaning cheerful endurance. It would seem that this is more than just being nice while you wait. It's really about how you endure something difficult. And this also seems to be linking endurance with keeping the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. So it'll be interesting to really review that principle that we've talked about before. And I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, Write, blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth. Now this is, eye-opening. Yes, believers are going to die in these judgments that are coming upon the earth in these bowls of wrath, because, that's just the nature of worldwide calamities. However, the blessing is that they die in the Lord, and that's going to be quite different from those who die outside of a relationship with Jesus Christ. The verse continues, "Yea, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, and their works do follow them." Let's quickly talk about these two words. Labors in the Greek is kopos, and it means a cut. That is toil as it reduces strength. Pains, it can be translated as weariness, but its root is to chop or to beat the breast. Okay, this seems to denote that the acts themselves, or the idea is that we've been diminished in strength, or maybe suffered a reduction in capacity. You're drained. Whereas this word works in Greek is ergon, and it means toil as an effort or occupation. So by implication, it's an act, deed, doing, labor, or work. And again, this is talking more about the acts themselves, which deplete us. Now, these words are obviously closely related, but it seems that the Greek word kopos, again, involves the draining that we feel from working. It's not only a reduction in strength, but a reduction in hope or peace or joy. So when the scriptures tell us that we rest from our labors, it's an emotional as well as physical resting. And Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown tell us, "Their full blessedness is now from henceforth, that is, from this time, when the judgment on the beast and the harvest gatherings of the elect are imminent. The time so earnestly longed for by the former martyrs is now all but come. Their eternal rest is close at hand. They are blessed in being about to sit down to the marriage supper of the Lamb, and in having part in the first resurrection, and in having right to the tree of life." As this commentary suggests, the martyrs of the fifth seal judgment were told to rest for yet a little season until their fellow servants and their brethren should be killed as they were. That season is just about over. That fifth seal began around 300 AD with the persecution from the Roman Empire. Rome is no more, and its reincarnation, the Holy Roman Empire, is about to go down. So this commentary is spot on. Albert Barnes adds, "In no other respect does man appear so dignified as in this. Nowhere do we so clearly see the grandeur of the soul as in the fact that what we do today may determine our happiness in that future period, when all the affairs of this world, which cannot now be numbered, shall have rolled by. It is then a glorious thing to live, and will be a glorious thing to die." These are indeed eternal perceptions. And this is the only view, really, a view of eternity that could console anyone in the middle of seeing all the bloodshed around him. Next, looking at the symbolism about the harvest of the earth. And verses 14 through 20 will show that this happens in two different stages. "And I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and upon the cloud sat one like unto the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him that sat on the cloud, Thrust in thy sickle, and reap, for the time is come for thee to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." So we see this being sitting upon a cloud, and we ask, is this an angel? But the texts suggest otherwise, because he's like unto the Son of Man, wearing a golden crown, even though he has a sharp sickle in his hand. This is not the grim reaper. In fact, this is probably what we should be picturing right now. But if we needed more proof, Daniel tells us in chapter 7 of his book about the vision of one like unto the Son of Man who comes in the clouds, approaching the Ancient of Days, sitting upon his throne. And this one, like the Son of Man, receives a dominion and glory and a kingdom. Now, this Son of Man is Yeshua. But also remember that Matthew and Luke tells us that Jesus Christ is the Lord of the harvest. So this is in keeping with the declared role of the Messiah. Next, we see another angel coming out of the temple, no doubt relaying this important message, saying it's time to reap the harvest because the earth is ripe. Of this picture, Mr. Barnes says, that is, the command was born directly from God by the angel to the Messiah to go forth and reap the great harvest of the world. He says it's not a command of the angel, but a command from God the Father to the Son. This is in accordance with all the representations in the New Testament that the Son, as Messiah or Redeemer, is subordinate to the Father and performs the work which has been given him to do. And next we're told in verse 16, and he that sat on the cloud thrust in his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped. Remember, I mentioned a moment ago that this is just the first of two harvests. And another angel came out of the temple, which is in heaven, he also having a sharp sickle. And yet another angel came out from the altar, which had power over fire, and cried with a loud voice to him that had the sharp sickle, saying, thrust in thy sharp sickle, and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe. And the angel thrust in his sickle into the earth, and gathered the vine of the earth, and cast it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. So this angel is to gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, because the grapes are ripe. And special attention is given to where the grapes are harvested from. They're harvested from the vine of the earth. And also where it's going to be cast, into the winepress of the wrath of God. Now in the final verse in this section, verse 20 tells us, and the winepress was trodden without the city, and blood came out of the winepress, even unto the horse bridles, by the space of 1,600 furlongs. When we get into the interpretation portion of today's video, we're going to talk more about this very curious and exacting detail of the depth of this blood. But for now, Mr. Barnes speaks to the location of the winepress. He says the winepress was usually in the vineyard, not in the city. And this is the representation here. As appearing to the eye of John, it was not within the walls of any city, but standing without or outside. That there would be great destruction, which would be well represented by the juice flowing from a winepress. Deep, he says, as the blood would be in a field of slaughter, where it would come up to the very bridles of the horses. Now, as to what city, the Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary postulates, if the city be Jerusalem, the scene of the bloodshedding of Christ and his people shall be also the scene of God's vengeance on the anti-Christian foe. The slaughter of the apostates is what is here spoken of, not their eternal punishment. Now, this is certainly an interesting perspective, that just as the Messiah was crucified outside the city walls of Jerusalem, this commentary suggests that this blood shall be shed also outside of Jerusalem. But we're going to see in the interpretation portion of today's video, Jerusalem probably wasn't what John had in view here. Now, chapter 15 is all about the seven angels with the seven plagues. And we're going to be able to cover this very quickly because it only has 8 verses. So let's go ahead and read those. And I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels having the 7 last plagues, for in them is filled up the wrath of God. This verse, says the Jamieson Fausset Brown commentary, is the summary of the vision that follows. The angels do not actually receive the vials until Revelation chapter 15, verse 7. But here, by anticipation, they are spoken of as having them. And I saw, as it were, a sea of glass mingled with fire, and them that had gotten the victory over the beast, and over his image, and over his mark, and over the number of his name, stand on the sea of glass, having the harps of God. This, of course, being in stark contrast to those who received his mark or his image or the number of his name. Remember, that third messenger or angel told us in the previous verses that was sufficient to warrant their participation in the lake of fire. As the sea typifies the troubled state out of which the beast arose, and which is to be no more in the blessed world to come, so the victorious saints stand on it, having it under their feet. But it is no longer treacherous wherein the feet sink, but solid like glass, as it was under the feet of Christ. Now, we discussed the sea of glass when looking at the throne room in heaven, and the possibility that, in contrast to the roaring sea or mobs of people on earth, in heaven all is harmonious. All are in complete alignment with their Creator. Treachery and falsehood, deception and danger, though in abundance here and now, are gloriously absent there. Where the beast of the sea reigned over God's people here on earth, they seem to be standing there triumphantly upon him. Verses 3 and 4. And they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and marvelous are thy works, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are thy ways, thou King of saints. Who shall not fear thee, O Lord, and glorify thy name? For only thou art holy. For all nations shall come and worship before thee, for thy judgments are made manifest. We see here a hint of the millennial kingdom, when all nations shall come up to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles, I believe. This is also then a hint that the timing of these verses are pointing towards that period of the earth, the end of the world. And again, the Jamieson, Fausset, and Brown commentary says the churches of the Old and New Testament are essentially one in their conflicts and triumphs. The two appear joined in this phrase, as they are in the 24 elders. Now this reminds us again that both kingdoms of Israel, Judah to the south and Ephraim to the north, which I still assert to be the Christians, are inevitably joined together into one house of Israel again. And the commentator John Gill really affirms this, weighing in on the Song of Moses. He says the Jews have a notion that the very Song of Moses itself from Exodus chapter 15 will be sung in the world to come, in the days of the Messiah. For they say there are in it the times of the Messiah, and of Gog and Magog, and of the resurrection of the dead, and of the world to come. In the next two verses, John records his first glimpse of these 7 angels as they were exiting the heavenly temple. And after that I looked, and behold, the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven was opened, and the 7 angels came out of the temple, having the 7 plagues, clothed in pure and white linen, and having their breasts girded with golden girdles. Matthew Henry suggests why their point of origin is important. Here is an allusion to the holiest of all the tabernacle and the temple, where the mercy seat was, covering the ark of the testimony, where the high priest made intercession, that in the judgments God was now about to execute upon the anti-Christian interest, he was fulfilling the prophecies and promises of his word and covenant, which were always before him. I think this is such an important point Mr. Henry's making. God did not just look down and decide, things are pretty bad, I better do something. The entirety of his word has been clear. The judgments that would come upon the wicked of the earth have been laid out definitively in his word from the beginning. This is nothing less than the promised fulfillment. And in verse 7 we read, "And one of the four beasts gave unto the seven angels 7 golden vials, full of the wrath of God, who lives forever and ever." I think this is just a reminder that at this stage, God and his word, as we said, are eternal. So what we see unfolding here is nothing new under the sun. Everyone is without excuse. And in our final verse for the day, verse 8, we read, "And the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power. And no man was able to enter into the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were fulfilled." You know, this seems to be a little contrary to what we were told just a moment ago, that the temple was open, but now no man can enter because of the smoke from the glory of God. What's the point of telling us this detail? Well, some people think this is the fact that no one can be saved at this point. But I think Albert Barnes sheds better light on the meaning. Until those vials had been poured out, and all that was indicated by them was accomplished. He says the meaning here seems to be that no one would be permitted to enter to make intercession, to turn away his wrath, or to divert him from his purpose. That is, the purpose of punishment had been formed and would certainly be executed. The agents or instrumentalities in this fearful work had been now sent forth, and they would by no means be recalled. The mercy seat in this respect was inaccessible. The time of judgment on the great foe had come, and the destruction of the grand enemy of the church was certain. The point, therefore, at which this vision leaves us is this: where all the preparations are made for the infliction of threatened punishment on the grand anti-Christian power which had so long stood up against the truth, where the agents had prepared to go forth, and where no intercession will ever avail to turn away the infliction of the divine wrath. Indeed, the detail of these events follow in the next chapters. Well, we have come to the historicist interpretation portion of the video today. But before we dive right in, I want to use some hindsight to help pinpoint our timeline. We saw in chapters 8 and 9 the first 6 trumpets. Chapter 10 was the second interval of the Reformation. In chapter 11, we met the 2 witnesses, but we also saw the 7th trumpet blow. Now, do you remember that the 7th judgment in each series is supposed to introduce the next set of judgments? But here John, or rather Messiah, chose instead to delay the introduction of the next series, because first he wanted to detail the woman and the dragon, the woman, of course, being his people, and the dragon, their arch enemy. We also discussed that chapter 12 was situated almost directly in the middle of the book of Revelation, seemingly separating the plight of his people from the plight of this dragon. Next, we were introduced to 2 beasts, the one from the sea and the other from the land, on whom these next judgments are going to fall. And I think it's more than poetic that Messiah seems to have distanced his people from this last set of judgments. Why? Because these judgments are not meant for his people. This wrath, the wrath of God, is meant for the beast kingdom and its citizens. If we can't grasp this important difference, we can hardly have hope that the Lord is returning soon. And this is, in my opinion, what leads to so much fear regarding this book. This is a huge distinction Yahweh is making, just like the distinctions he made between the Hebrew children and the Egyptians. This wrath is not to punish his people. But I still hear it so often today that the events we see unfolding is because Israel hasn't accepted their Messiah yet, or because there are ungodly leaders in America or in Israel. They think God is punishing his people. But all we have to do is tweak our view to align with the book of Revelation, and we begin to see that these events, current events even, are to take down the beast kingdom, no less than the trumpet judgments took down the kingdom of Rome. Yeah, we saw Rome punish God's people because of his judgments upon them, and so, as we said earlier, believers will die in the Lord during these judgments, but that's not the same thing as Yahweh punishing his people. In fact, it seems expressly evident to me that when God punished his people, it was predominantly by their captivity. And God's word is also clear that when Messiah came, he was going to set free the captives. And that's exactly what he did when he came the first time. He ushered in the latter days, the day of the Lord. Again, the seals weakened the Roman Empire, that last Gentile kingdom to rule over his people. Next, the trumpets destroyed that empire. And even with the rise of the beast kingdom at that point, his people were more hidden than captured, hidden in that wilderness, in that barren land, until the appointed time when he would instruct them to leave Babylon. Finally, we're going to see these bold judgments first weaken and then destroy the Holy Roman Empire, the papal kingdom. And so chapters 14 and 15 were indeed visions of hope for the weary martyrs. This reincarnated beast, this Holy Roman Empire, and the beast from the land, the papacy, are about to go down. Now, we've not heard from Christine Miller and her book, The Revelation of Jesus Christ Revealed, in quite some time, but she helps us to understand more about the timing of these chapters. She says we are now picking up our thread of history during the second interval, which was begun at the opening of the little book and the revealing of the two witnesses. Revelation chapter 13 ends at the height of the power of the Roman beasts, who wield so much temporal power that no one can make war with them. No one can withstand them, and no one can buy or sell unless they bear the mark of their name. She says this detail was fulfilled during the Middle Ages. In Revelation chapter 14, the scene begins to drastically change. She says, the true Lamb appears on Mount Zion. The tide is now going to turn. Can't you just almost hear that crescendo? So now we're going to look at each aspect of these visions to determine what the spiritual interpretations or implications might be, and how it is exactly that these are visions of hope. And the very first thing we really need to understand is that this is not a new group of people. This should be obvious, right? These are those sealed from chapter 7, as Mr. Barnes reaffirms. These are evidently the same persons that were seen in the vision recorded in Revelation chapter 7. And the representation is made for the same purpose, to sustain the church in trial with the certainty of its future glory. There, he says, it is merely said that they were sealed in their foreheads. The passage here shows how they were sealed. They had the name of God so stamped or marked on their foreheads as to show that they belonged to him. Now, I believe this is still symbolism, The reformers, as I said before, and the historicists even didn't really understand the mark of God. So it's hard to know what they really thought the mark was. I mean, we remember Mr. Barnes speaking about tattoos that sailors or soldiers sometimes voluntarily received. But no one in the history of the world were ever literally tattooed with the name of Yahweh on their foreheads, not supernaturally, and certainly not in mass. So this is again Revelation's way of saying that, biblically speaking, these people were protected by keeping God's commandments and his feast days. They did not succumb to rejecting the word of God in favor of the Antichrist's commands and feast days. And Mr. Henry also asserts this very point. Their distinguishing badge, he says, they had the name of God written in their foreheads. They had made a bold and open profession of their faith in God and Christ. And this being followed by suitable actings, they are known and approved. Suitable actings equals obedience. Next, as regards the fact that they are virgins, Albert Barnes, in quoting Wilhelm de Wet, a German biblical scholar from 1805, says, "The sense cannot be that all these 144,000 had lived an unmarried life. For how could the Apostle Peter and others who were married have been excluded? But the reference must be to those who held themselves from all impurity, which, in the view of the apostles, was closely connected with idolatry." Next, seed.info, in an article entitled "Idolatry Equals Adultery. It's Personal," highlights this connection. They say the first commandment is about idolatry, and in the Bible, idolatry is compared to adultery. The worship of idols is compared to marital unfaithfulness. Whenever God's people give themselves over to idols, they are committing spiritual adultery. And we belong to the jealous God. He is jealous that we would be committed to him only. Remember, I'm only picking a handful of examples that can be found that support this symbolic interpretation of Revelation. And BibleRelief.com is another example who agrees with this premise. They say the 144,000 are called virgins in this verse. The Greek word used here is parthenoi, and most often is a reference to those who have abstained from sex. But they say the same word can also be used as a reference to spiritual purity. Now, many of you are probably going to disagree here. You may believe that these will be virgins in the conventional sense. But I think if we back up and consider the dire consequences connected with the priestly and monastic systems, if you will, of the Roman Catholic Church, we begin to see the real danger in viewing these prophecies so narrowly. The Bible is clear. Marriage is a holy ordinance. Yahweh said it's not good for man to be alone. And BibleRelief.com, again, is going to drive home the possible picture here. I mean, especially given that Jesus' parable of the wise virgins refers to his bride, and that would be you and me. They say these men refused to participate in the idolatrous worship of the beast. They're like the wise virgins Jesus described as having oil in their lamps while they waited for the bridegroom. I'm going to offer one final witness on this point, on this interpretation. HeraldMagazine.org, in an article entitled "A Chaste Virgin," say chastity is further detailed in Revelation 14, verse 4, where, speaking of the 144,000, John says, "These are they which were not defiled with women, for they are virgins." They tell us in Revelation, a book of symbols, it's easy to see that not literal women, but worldly churches are what is being referred to. In other words, spiritual chastity is a separating from a worldly environment. I happen to think that the final book of the Bible, this book of Revelation, particularly in chapter 21, seals the meaning here. John is introduced to the Lamb's wife, New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. And like any good saga, the rider on the white horse sweeps up his bride and rides off into eternity. So we shouldn't be surprised that God's faithful people are likened unto pure virgins. This doesn't have to be a literal fulfillment. That would be certainly a miracle. But there is this idea of a very symbolic fulfillment. God's people are chaste, or certainly should be. You know, we know from chapter 7 that the 144,000 consisted of 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, and that led to an innumerable number of worshipers from nations, kindreds, people, and tongues. What could be clearer than the fact that this picture of the Lamb and the 144,000 standing victoriously upon Mount Zion is none other than the bride as a chaste virgin standing next to her bridegroom. And this prophecy is meant to encourage the battle-weary saints of their sure reward. And next we're going to be looking at the messages of the three angels, looking at the spiritual implications of their messages. We remember that the first angel was heralding the everlasting gospel as he flew through the air. And Bernard Starr, from Huffington Post, in his article, Why Christians Were Denied Access to Their Bible for 1,000 Years, he builds the case as to the importance of this first message. He says the Council of Nicaea, called by the Emperor Constantine, met in 325 of the Common Era to establish a unified Catholic Church. At that point, no universally sanctioned scriptures or Christian Bible existed. He asks, wouldn't you assume that the newly established church would want its devotees to immerse themselves in the sanctioned New Testament, especially since the church went to great lengths to eliminate competing gospels? And wouldn't the best way of spreading the good news be to ensure that every Christian had direct access to the Bible? Well, he tells us that's not what happened. The church actually discouraged the populace from reading the Bible on their own, a policy that intensified through the Middle Ages and later, with the addition of a prohibition forbidding translation of the Bible into native languages. Now, we saw this when we looked at the history of the Roman Catholic Church. So now this angel flying through the air, declaring the everlasting gospel, well, it certainly signifies that something has definitely changed. And Christine Miller spells it out for us. She says it's been since the Reformation that the preaching of the everlasting gospel, i.e., that salvation or right standing before God is by faith in Jesus Christ and not works, has gone forth. To this day, ministries like Wycliffe Bible translators are taking the everlasting gospel to the last of the nation's tribes, tongues, and peoples. So this proclamation, she says, has been going forwards since the time of the Reformation. Now, these are the kinds of gems that I talk about being in this book that help us to really anchor the timeline here. For over 1,000 years, God's people were kept in the dark by the Roman Catholic Church. But since the Reformation, since this second interval period, the gospel is now being preached to the world. The good news had once again gone forth throughout the world. These aren't just coincidences, but I believe they're direct evidences that this is the correct view of the book. And this is also another good time to remind you that during intervals, spiritual events unfold and they roll on throughout time. Remember, the 144,000 were sealed in the first interval, and that was a picture of salvation. But people have been continually saved since the time of Christ. And likewise, the gospel here, going out to the world, it has continued since John 8, that little book. So don't be confused that this began in the late 1500s and it's still ongoing. That's the nature of these intervals between the judgments. The judgments themselves can actually be linked to specific events in history, but these intervals describe more of a rolling out of, events in the spiritual realm. Now, of the second angel's message, that Babylon is fallen, in her book, The Revelation of Jesus Christ Revealed, Christine writes that one possible interpretation might be that the ancient city of Babylon is rebuilt in the end times and will be destroyed again. But we know that the ancient city of Babylon was destroyed by the Persians. But by the 1970s, Saddam Hussein indeed attempted at least to recreate this fabled city. But it has been partially destroyed by decades of war. So even though one might say it was in fact rebuilt and has been destroyed again, is this the fair interpretation of this passage? I think Christine comes closer to the answer with this next excerpt. She says there is a second possibility, and that's that Babylon, which has not been a city of influence since its conquest by the ancient Romans, is not the name of a literal city, but a descriptive name of a source of citizenship of the earth or the world, just as Zion is not a literal city, but a descriptive name for a source of citizenship of heaven. She says it's the philosophy and worldview of Babylon, meaning the rebellion against God, the independence of man, the worship of nature, of self, of materialism, and occultism and wickedness that will fall as the everlasting gospel is preached to all the world. She says that's what I believe the prophecy means. So the first two proclamations announce the preaching of the everlasting gospel and the fall of the kingdoms of this world as the Lamb appears on Mount Zion with those who have been marked by his Father's name coming with him. Those two events are occurring right now and have been since the time of the Reformation. It's fair to say that the first two angels have messages of good news. First, that the gospel is finally being preached in its purest form. And secondly, that as a result of that preaching of the gospel, the systems and kingdoms of this world, i.e. Babylon, are falling. But the third angel's message comes more as a warning and exhortation than encouragement. And Mr. Barnes begins the commentary on this third angel's message. If any man worship the beast or receive his mark, he says the general meaning is that they were guilty of idolatry of a gross form. And wherever this existed, they who were guilty of it would come under the denunciations in the scriptures against idolaters. As I said just moments ago, the Bible speaks explicitly about the danger of idolatrous practices. It should come as no surprise that idolatry is swiftly and severely punished by God. Grace never tolerates idolatry. It is never acceptable in Yahweh's economy to commit spiritual adultery in any way, shape, or form. And John Gill clarifies again for us what it means to receive the mark of the beast. He says to give in to the idolatries of the Church of Rome and embrace, maintain, and defend the popish religion, which bears a resemblance to the worship of the heathens, and is the very image of Rome pagan. To openly profess popery or swear allegiance to the man of sin, and to do all they can to support his interest. Mr. Gill's no-holds-barred response to what it means to receive this beast's mark is simply elegant. It's powerful, and it's very exacting. Let's look again at that scripture in chapter 14, verses 10 and 11. By saying that those who receive his mark will drink from the wine of the wrath of God, make no mistake, John is referencing to the 7 bowls that are about to be poured out upon not only the beast, but also those who have received his mark. And the fact that they're going to burn and be tormented with fire and brimstone forever, he's again referencing the lake of fire. So this third third message ought to give us all cause to reflect carefully as to whether we have any connection with this beast. And then we saw that John is told that these saints should be patient in everything. Not only the war that this beast makes upon them, but also the sheer magnitude of life as they know it, crumbling all around them with the coming judgments. And this patience, again, is somehow connected with keeping the commandments of God and having the faith in the true Messiah. Do we see the two witnesses here? We should. And again, just regarding this word patience, we really should say endurance. It really means that. And I think this makes the difference. John's really, again, not telling us or telling them to be patient while all this is happening around them. He's telling them that the way in which they're going to survive everything is by keeping God's commandments and refusing to substitute the real Messiah for another Jesus. Remember, God's mark equals protection. And lastly, we're told that they will be blessed who die in the Lord because they're going to finally rest and that their reward is sure. Well, the two reapers finish out chapter 14. And though a mere 6 verses cover these details, let me say that the traditional historicist views are all over the place. Okay, mostly people think it's really one harvest just being described in 2 different ways, and it's all about the wicked being cut off by the judgments that are coming. But some believe that these are 2 resurrections, one to life and the other to judgment. Let me say that I favor this last possibility, that these really are 2 resurrections separated by the millennial reign of Christ. And now I'm going to tell you why I believe that. We're going to begin with looking at the idea of the harvest used in Matthew chapter 13, where we find the familiar parable of the tares. I believe Jesus was not only teaching about heavenly things when using these parables, but he was giving us tools to understand other scriptures, not the least of which is this book of Revelation. It's in this parable, and we've seen it before, that we learn that the sower is the Son of Man, the field is the world, the good seed are the righteous ones, the tares are the wicked ones, the enemy sower is the devil, the harvest is the end of the world, and angels will be doing some reaping while the tares are gathered and burned. Now, we want to focus on the fact right here that Jesus himself tells us the harvest is the end of the world. And we really got a hint of that just moments ago, but this really doubles down on that. It seems fair that we've got the right time frame in view, the end of the world. But it's going to be helpful to understand a little bit more about harvests from a biblically correct agricultural aspect. And it goes without saying that, the Bible was written foremost to farmers and shepherds, and certainly in a period of time when the world was based upon an agriculturally based economy and culture. So we're going to reap a lot of knowledge from this next article, The 3 Harvests from Heart of Worship Church. They begin by telling us, in Israel, the first harvest is the barley harvest. It was considered the poor man's harvest. It's a simple grain that's full of nutrition and low in sugar and gluten, so that the bread that it makes is not so pleasant to the palate, but is very good for you. It's full of healing virtue, satisfying to the hungry soul, able to sustain those who partook of it. It was this grain, they say, that God chose to represent Jesus, who Paul called the first fruits of the resurrection. The unleavened bread of the Passover would have been made of this, as well as the bread in the story of the loaves and fishes. Jesus himself said that he was the bread of life, and those who eat of him would never hunger again. No other can compare. None can satisfy like he can. He's our strength and our healing, our portion who was broken for our transgression, the first harvest of undesirable poor man's bread that, as unlikely as it seems, is the perfection of heaven. In a moment, we're going to see this beautiful connection between this first harvest and the first fruit resurrection. But let's continue now in the Heart of Worship's article. They say the next harvest is the wheat harvest. This harvest represents the saints. Christ was resurrected first, then a new crop was planted. Next, they say, we'll see the harvest of these come to its fulfillment. Jesus gave us a parable of a man, himself, who planted good seed, his words, and then his enemy came after him and planted weeds, false doctrines and lies in the field. The good seed, he said, was wheat, and it represented the saints who received his words and became fruitful. The third and final harvest is the grape harvest. This is a harvest of sinners. They're gathered into the winepress of God's wrath in the end. They say the very sad thing about this harvest is that Jesus already endured it for us to provide a way of escape from it. He drank the cup of wrath, the grape juice. He was crushed for our transgression until his blood poured out. He did not deserve this, yet he willingly did it for us. And in doing so, he gave us a reprieve. But this wrath is still coming for all those who are not found hidden in him. This harvest of grapes is a sobering picture. I've used that word several times because that's what we're talking about. The blood on Jesus' robes at his first coming was his own. But we have good reason to think that the blood-soaked robe that he wears upon his return is not his this time, but those whom he will slay with the sword of his mouth. So let's quickly recap these three harvests. We see the barley harvest representing Passover and the Lamb who takes away the sin of the world. The wheat harvest, which is gathered at the time of Shavuot or Pentecost, it clearly represents those saints who have accepted Messiah, because Pentecost is often referred to as the birth of the church. And finally, the grape harvest, gathered in the fall feast, particularly Yom Kippur, the day of judgment that's recognized and memorialized in Yahweh's feasts, those feasts we talked about the last time. You know, this may be the first time some of you are hearing this information, and I know it's a lot of information, but don't worry, we are going to review this again. Now, as to looking at the actual spiritual implications of those final two visions, that of the first and second harvests, we begin with Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown, whom we've heard a lot from this time out. They tell us by the harvest reaping, the elect righteous are gathered out. By the vintage, the anti-Christian offenders are removed out of the earth. The scene, Christ's coming kingdom. The Son of Man himself with a golden crown is introduced in the harvest gathering of the elect, only a mere angel in the vintage. And Mr. Barnes again confirms that this isn't a grim reaper, but the Lord of the harvest himself. That is, the harvest which thou art to reap is ripe. The seed which thou hast sown has grown up. The earth which thou hast cultivated has produced this golden grain, and it is fit that thou shouldest now gather it in. Shortly after Yeshua came to earth, it's recorded in John chapter 4, verse 35, that he told his disciples, "Behold, I say unto you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields, for they are white already to harvest." So this is the fulfillment of that picture there in the book of John. Yeshua harvesting those he has sown. Mr. Barnes continues, here the references to the consummation of all things, when the great harvest of the world will be reaped, and when all the enemies of the church will be cut off. For that is the grand idea which is kept before the mind in this chapter. In various forms and by various images, That idea had already been presented to the mind. But here it is introduced in a grand closing image, as if the grain of the harvest field were gathered in, illustrating the reception of the righteous into the kingdom. And the fruit of the vineyard were thrown into the winepress, representing the manner in which the wicked would be crushed. So far as the righteous were concerned, says Mr. Barnes, the end had come. The church was redeemed. The work contemplated was accomplished, and the results of the work of the Savior were like a glorious harvest. Now Mr. Barnes contrasts this first harvest with the second one. This angel coming out from the altar. The altar, he says, stood in the front of the temple and was the place where burnt sacrifices were made. As the work now to be done was a work of destruction, this was an appropriate place in the representation. Matthew Henry goes so far as to say this second harvest could possibly consist of two parts. The first being the cutting off and gathering the clusters of the vine, which were now ripe and ready, fully ripe. And secondly, casting these grapes into the winepress. He says we're told first what the winepress was. It was the wrath of God, the fire of his indignation, some terrible calamity, very probably the sword, shedding the blood of the wicked. Secondly, where the place of the winepress was, outside the city. We're going to talk about the fact that this winepress was outside the city in just a moment, but first, the Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary will focus on what is harvested this time. The vine is what is the subject of judgment, because its grapes are not what God looked for, considering its careful culture, but wild grapes. Those verses in the book of Isaiah comprise a message to Israel from God about a very carefully prepared vineyard that brought forth wild grapes. And John Gill also points out a difference in this vine. He says, before, the sickle was thrust upon the earth, when the harvest was gathered in, the wheat being on the earth but not belonging to it. But here, he says it's cast or thrust into the earth, the vine being the vine of the earth, rooted in it and natural to it. Some of Jesus' words should be coming to our minds right about now. I am the vine, ye are the branches. He that abides in me and I in him, the same brings forth much fruit, for without me you can do nothing. This is a counterfeit vine, producing counterfeit fruit. John Gill says the Arabic version reads, of the whole earth, in like manner as the tares in the parable are said to be gathered and bound in bundles and cast into the fire, which, as here, intends the destruction of the wicked at the end of the world. He says this vine may be said to be cut down at the burning of the world and to be gathered at the second resurrection, as the wheat harvest of the saints will be at this first resurrection. And Mr. Barnes informs us on his view of the depth of the blood crushed from these wild grapes. By the space of 1,600 furlongs, that is, 200 miles square, a lake of blood. He says this is designed to represent a great slaughter, but why the space here employed to describe it was chosen is unknown. Some, he says, have supposed it was an allusion to the length of Palestine. Professor Stewart supposes that it refers to the breadth of Italy, and that the allusion is the attack made on the city of the beast. So with all the talk about where this winepress really is, we're going to now talk about some real possibilities. This map shows the location of the ancient tell of Meggido. It's situated at the base of the Carmel Mountains overlooking the Jezreel Valley. And you can see where that's located in Israel on the map at the top, and a picture of it there on the bottom. It's beautiful. My family and I got a chance to overlook that when we went to Mount Carmel. We're going to see, though, that the term the Jezreel Valley is really interchangeable with the Valley of Megiddo, or, as the book of Revelation calls it, Armageddon. Zion Oil wants us to know that this Jezreel Valley is the large valley in northern Israel that includes the biblical tribal areas of Manasseh. In that wide, flat valley, they say, there is the ancient town of Megiddo. This valley has also been called the Plain of Megiddo in Zechariah chapter 12. This ancient city has also been mentioned in the ancient Egyptian writings of 1478 BC. This strategic location is at the opening of a narrow pass on the ancient Great Highway connecting Egypt to the south and Assyria to the north. In the apocalyptic vision, the kings are gathered in the area of Armageddon, Har Megiddo in Hebrew, meaning at the hill of Megiddo, the traditional location of the Battle of Armageddon, which precedes God's final judgment on the earth. I hope it's obvious why we're talking about this valley right now, but before we discuss the future of this valley, let's first talk about some of its history. Holman Bible Dictionary tells us that it's called Esdraelon in the Greek language. It's the translation of the word meaning Jezreel. It indicates the low-lying area separating the mountains of Galilee from the mountains of Samaria. Old Testament Esdraelon, also called the Great Plain of Esdraelon, or the Plain of Jezreel, extends from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River at Bethshean. Included are the Valley or Plain of Megiddo in the east and the Valley of Jezreel in the west. The historical and biblical significance of Esdraelon in the Old Testament is its association with war and bloodshed. As the battleground, it was a strategically favored place. And Logos.com asks, is the Jezreel Valley the stage for the final battle? While they tell us no less than 34 battles have occurred in or around this area, it was here that Deborah and Barak trounced Sisera. The Philistines defeated the Israelites. Gideon defeated the Midianites and the Amalekites. The Crusaders fought no less than 4 separate battles here. Napoleon Bonaparte crushed the Ottomans in 1799, and General George Allenby fought them again in 1918 at the end of World War I. So it's not really surprising that this area has been active throughout history because of its location. Again, not only to major trade routes and the civilizations of the past, but I believe because it's belonged to the people of God for much of that time. I mean, when you think about it, when we think about the righteous Abel's blood calling out to God from the ground, there's more to it. It's almost as if the earth takes on a judiciary role in calling for God's recompense. I think John is referencing this valley as the location of the winepress of the wrath of God because of the history of this plain and because of the purpose of these bowls of wrath. And next, BibleArchaeology.org tells us that John most likely knew of the history of this battlefield, and they highlight an incredible link between its history and future. In their article, Why Megiddo? They say it's even more important than John's knowledge of the Jezreel Valley as an ancient battlefield was his awareness that King Josiah, Judah's last effective and independent ruler from the house of David, had died in battle at Megiddo. For John, the coming of the Messiah at the Battle of Armageddon would at last and forever restore the Davidic monarchy. John recognized Jesus as the descendant of David. So when the Messiah leads his troops at Megiddo, he will not only exact revenge for the death of his ancestor Josiah, but also restore the Davidic line to power in the very same spot. That is pretty important to understand that Josiah was the last king of Judah, and there has been no other and will be no other until the Messiah sits on that throne unchallenged. Now, Logos.com also says that for millennia, this valley has been like a magnet, wooing the nations to war, and for good reason, they say. Located at the crossroads of two international travel routes, the Jezreel Valley has always been of strategic importance for travel, trade, and military campaigns. The great fortress city of Meggido lies at the junction of the international and coastal highways. Maybe it's obvious, but maybe it's not. I want to point out on the map to the right, Lebanon's proximity to this valley. Given all of the current day tensions in this area, I can't stress enough that it's only 37 miles from Meggido, Israel, to the Lebanon border. For that matter, it's a short 62 miles from Meggido to the border with Syria. This magnet seems to be wooing nations to war still today. In fact, I intend to show good reason to suggest that this is where the winepress of the wrath of God is located, because this winepress is the culmination of those bowls, those 7 judgments that are about to be poured upon the earth. This isn't conjecture. I can prove this out, I believe, by the scriptures themselves. But we have to go to chapter 16, to the book of Revelation, where those bowls begin to be poured out upon the earth. Now remember, and I'm not going to put this up on the screen, but verse 1, where the first angel goes to pour out his vial or his bowl upon the earth, it's clear that those are full of the wrath of God. But it's verse 12 where we see the 6th bowl judgment being poured out. The 7th bowl isn't poured out until verse 17. But an awful lot happens in between those 2 verses, just between the 6th judgment and the 7th judgment. In verses 13 and 14, we read about 3 unclean spirits that come out of the mouths of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. They go forth into the kings of the earth to gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty. And just 2 verses later, we read that it's really Yahweh who gathers them together into a place called in the Hebrew tongue, Armageddon. Notice, they're only gathered at this point. There is no battle yet. But even more incredible is what verse 15 reveals. And in the King James Red Letter Edition, Messiah talking says, "Behold, I come as a thief. Blessed is he that watches and keeps his garment, lest he walk naked and they see his shame." This is huge. This is Messiah telling us that he returns just after he has gathered them together for battle. Why? Well, because it's Jesus Christ and his armies who battle them. But we're not going to see that battle until chapter 19. Verse 15, where out of his mouth goes a sharp sword, that with it he should smite the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron, and he treadeth the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God. He gathered them just before the 7th bowl is poured out, which is his return. Remember, the last judgment introduces the next event, and that's when he slays them. It's just that John's going to interrupt again the narrative to give us more parenthetical information about the whore sitting on the beast and what it looks like when Babylon falls. We're only talking about this battle of Armageddon and Christ's return here today because of the visions of the wheat harvest and the grape harvest, the resurrection of life and the resurrection unto death, which will happen after the millennial kingdom. This is going to be discussed in greater detail, of course, when we get to those chapters, but it's necessary to give you the big picture now so that later we can piece things together more easily. Don't worry, we're going to go over it again and again and again. In our next 2 videos, we're actually going to cover the bowl judgments in detail. But I can't pass up this opportunity to exclaim that I believe these events between the 6th and the 7th bowl judgments, the third and final interval, is where we are at present. Certainly between verses 14 and 15, just prior to Messiah's return, as things heat up in the Middle East, just miles away from the valley or Meggido. No, this isn't date setting. This is discerning the season. And we're told by Messiah that good Bible students ought to be able to know when the time is near. So let's look once again at these biblical feasts, these biblical harvests, which I'm suggesting represent resurrections. First, we see the barley harvest, which represents Yeshua, who was the first fruits resurrection, 3 days and 3 nights after he was crucified and buried. This happened, of course, at his first coming. But remember, after Yeshua arose from the dead, they arose. Who? Well, the bodies of the saints that slept, whose graves had been opened during the earthquake at Jesus' death. We can read about that in chapter 27 of Matthew. So indeed, Yeshua and whoever those souls were qualify as the first or early harvest resurrection. The wheat harvest, I submit, represents the first resurrection unto life from the book of Revelation. And that is, of course, going to occur after his second coming. And we can read about that in 1 Thessalonians verse 4, where in the twinkling of an eye we shall all be changed. But we shall not precede those who have died, for the dead in Christ shall rise first, and then we shall join him in the air, and so shall we ever be with Christ. We're going to cover this more fully in chapter 20, so we're not going to worry about the details right now. But suffice it to say, I believe at his second coming is when he slays those gathered for battle in the valley of Meggido. That's where the actual battle is recorded. And that leaves us the grape harvest, representing the second resurrection unto death. And that, of course, will occur after the millennium. We can read about that. It's recorded in chapter 20, verse 5. Okay, I hope you appreciate that little side that we did. Just putting these harvests, the wheat and the grape harvest, in their respective places, I believe, according to the historicist view. And now we finally reached chapter 15. Again, these few verses, 1 through 8, on the 7 angels and the 7 plagues. And we're going to go through this very quickly. In short, this is the introduction of those 7 angels with those 7 plagues. And they are going to be poured out upon the beast kingdom. And the first 4 are going to weaken it, and the final 2 will destroy it, at which time Messiah will throw the beast and the false prophet into the lake of fire. And that will happen, of course, just prior to him incarcerating the dragon in the bottomless pit for 1,000 years. At the end of these bowl judgments, the messianic millennial kingdom is ushered in. Chapters 14 and 15 really do close out the second interval period. The visions are meant to give hope to the martyrs because the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy, otherwise known as the beast from the sea and the land, and the destroyers of the earth, just like the Roman Empire, will be destroyed. Messiah is coming again, and he's going to have with him his reward to repay all people according to their deeds. And then there's going to be a resurrection unto life as Messiah returns and the dead in Christ arise, and those of us who remain and are alive will be caught up together with him, as I said. But John is also given here a picture of the second resurrection, the one that leads to death, the second death. Those whose names are not found written in the Lamb's book of life will have to stand before the judgment throne of God and answer for their deeds, answer for their counterfeit fruit, the wild grapes. Yes, the second interval is officially over, but not before covering a lot of very important information. Information that Messiah wanted us to know. Information that, according to the history, did indeed encourage and reprove and direct God's people. And it's information that you and I can still be encouraged by today. As I said in the very beginning of this series, we have every reason to hope because most of this is behind us. We're not looking for these beasts to rise up. We are waiting for their final and complete demise. And with that said, we have all but concluded today's video, Prelude to the End. But if you'll allow me to make one final point today, as things are getting ready to be wrapped up, understand that the sealed judgments took just over 200 years to be completed. The trumpet judgments took about 1,000 years. And to date, the first 6 bowl judgments, if this historicist view is correct, only took 128 years to unfold. There's no pattern here. Anything is possible. If you'll recall the video that we did on the 1,260 years of the Beast Kingdom and its possible timeframes, the earliest possible beginning was around 257 AD. Likewise, the most likely ending was 1861 AD. And remember, this latter option was my personal favorite. And that would put the reign of the Beast Kingdom somewhere in this vicinity. So, looking ahead today to where we are in 2024, with one more judgment left, the 7th bowl judgment, we're very near the end of the 3rd interval. Messiah is very likely to come in our lifetime. And with that said, if there's time, next time on the Book of Revelation, Historicist View, Part 24, The Wine of God's Wrath Poured Out. If you have received the mark of the beast, if you're loyal to the Holy Roman Empire, you will partake in the plagues that hit the earth, water, rivers, and sun. Yes, these plagues will very much mirror the first 4 trumpets, because remember, they're going to weaken the Holy Roman Empire in much the same way that the first 4 trumpets weakened the Roman Empire. Yahweh is a God of order, and his word will perform its work. Amen? I hope you can join me next time on Part 24, The Wine of God's Wrath Poured Out. Until then, stay well, keep studying, and shalom.